Hello, everyone. This is Seth with the World of Paleoanthropology, and today, with this episode of The Story of Us, I know it's been a little while, we have a very special guest. I'm excited to introduce him. I actually met him at the AABAs. It was a fun little time that we had there. So why don't you introduce yourself so we know who we're talking to?
Hi, Seth. Thank you for having me on the show. My name is Zach Cofran. I am a biological anthropologist, associate professor here at Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York. And yeah, I teach about human evolution. I do research into human evolution and growth and development, and yeah, it's a fun time in general. So yeah.
I would definitely say you have some fun. I follow you on, I refuse to call it X. I follow you on Twitter. Um, and I see a lot of your fun posts about all of the different comparisons you're doing, especially on Homo naledi and things like that. It's very interesting work that you're doing. Definitely kind of what sparked my interest in your work. And so you said you track growth and development. What does that mean? Are you tracking it in one species? Are you tracking it across species? What are you looking at?
Yeah, so the general framework that kind of unites all of my research is the evolution of growth and development. And so we can kind of contrast these two types of change that we see in the biological world. So evolution on the one hand looks at how species or populations change over time, how you end up with new species and new kinds of animals, or the extinction of animals for that matter. Um, Whereas development or growth and development really comprise individual phenomena, basically from the embryonic period all the way up to birth and childhood and adulthood and ultimately death, of course. And so what I find very interesting about this is when you think about morphological evolution or kind of the anatomical change that we can document in the fossil record between different species over time. Uh, Growth and development are going to be the mechanisms that actually affect this change. So when you end up with new anatomies, for instance, in the fossil record, it's because you have modifications to, how a bone grows or when teeth come into the mouth or something like that. And so it's a really, I think, very fascinating way to look at kind of how and why evolution works. And so this involves uh, yeah, comparing patterns of growth and development in living humans and chimpanzees and gorillas and other primates to see kind of what we can compare with what limited evidence we get with the fossil record. So it's the fossil record is already a bit of a puzzle, as it were, right? You only get bits and pieces. I'm trying to stop fidgeting, or rather, I'm fidgeting with this little printout of a parietal bone from an Australopithecus, where this
I
is
was wondering what that was.
yeah, sorry, it's from one of my latest papers. No, it's one of the more relatively complete specimens that we have in the fossil record, but it's still just a tiny little piece, right, of
Right.
a overall puzzle. And so growth and development kind of adds this other interesting dimension to this puzzle. Yeah, so that's kind of the general overview of my what I'd like to teach about. And I have a class as well, human evolutionary developmental biology, which is kind of a mouthful. When I was at my previous institution, I think it was called Building Babies. It was a little bit catchier. Um, we didn't talk about babies that much, though. But
That's yeah, that's
that's
fun.
what we're
That's
doing here in my
perfect.
lab.
So you say, and it's quite clear by what you're describing, that this definitely gives a different window and different insights into the fossil record than if we're just looking at, well, here's a Homo erectus versus here's a Homo habilis. You're
Mhm.
looking more within the species at the changes that happen on a more, dare I say, micro level within the species versus something happening to the whole species. So, what got you interested in this window of looking into the fossils?
I don't know if I recall exactly, honestly. So I went to graduate school at the University of Michigan, where I was very I worked with Milford Walpoff, and so I was very interested in just human evolution kind of generally. And in the midst of the graduate studies there, I spent a lot of time in the paleontology department, and there was a researcher there, Miriam Zeldich, who had done a lot of kind of evolutionary developmental morphometric, landmark type of analyses. And so I want to say that perhaps doing like brown bag research talk type seminar things with that group there might have been what actually sparked the interest in growth and development. Yeah, actually, I haven't haven't thought about this in a while. It's just one of those things where suddenly like a light bulb kind of
Right.
of like, oh, this is actually a really fascinating way to look at evolutionary change and try to tease out information from a very sparse fossil record. And so once I kind of figured that angle, it took some time to figure out then kind of how I could study it in the
Mhm.
fossil record. Usually to study growth, you need lots of different points in time. For the most part, we can contrast studying like an individual person over the course of their life. That would take a very long time to do, and you'd have
Mhm.
to like be like, hold still so I can measure your height or something like that. But when we look at this in museum collections and in the fossil record, we basically get these snapshots in time, right? Of, this poor infant died at this age, and then now we have a juvenile that died that, probably a few years older and so forth. So you get these very, very incomplete pictures. And so what I was trying to do in my dissertation research and some of my earlier work was figure out what inferences can we make, given the nature of the evidence, the in many ways kind of less than ideal fossil record for growth and development. To look at skeletal change, you can do all kinds of stuff with teeth, but
Right.
you're clear of those a bit. Yeah, so at some point in graduate school, I think I was just like, oh, well, look at growth and evolution.
So
How,
I know again from the horrible land of Twitter
yeah,
that you do a lot of work on brains and endocasts. As we can see behind you, you have quite a few. What
these old things.
those old things?
Yeah.
What work specifically do you do with them, and what insights do they bring in what you're looking at overall?
Yeah. So brains got onto my radar initially because I guess the other aspect of growth and development that's very interesting from an evolutionary perspective, um, which sounds very boring now that I've said that out loud. But what's actually very interesting about it is how individuals grow is something that really reflects an allocation of energy across the lifespan. And so patterns of growth themselves not only give rise to these adult morphologies that we can say, oh, this is how, the Tong child could have grown into, Mrs. Ples, STS5,
Right.
name is Australopithecus africanus cranium. But it's also really important for looking at species adaptations to the environment and how they acquire and use energy. And so when you look at humans, we do seem to be a little bit different from other primates in terms of how we grow and especially how long our childhood and juvenile period lasts. And so it's kind of in that context that I started looking at the brain, because the brain is going to take a lot of our energy and a lot of life history variation, or kind of, yeah, a lot of variability in the life course of different primates is going to reflect or be driven by variation in brain size and the caloric or energetic requirements of the brain. And so that's how I started looking at this question with Homo erectus, because you have this little infant from a site called Mojokerto in Java.
Mhm.
And so I was like, oh, well, we have this one data point for an infant. What can this tell us about how they're growing? And so I had worked with Jeremy De Silva to come up with a way to
Mm.
uh, basically do a kind of randomization or simulation based analysis to kind of reconstruct growth rates of the brain in Homo erectus. And I've applied that in a couple other contexts. So that's what really turned me on to thinking about the brain more broadly, because not only is it going to be an important part of kind of how we get our calories and what we do with our calories that are really fundamental for our existence. But it's also what gives us culture and language and theory of mind and all this other really cool stuff that arguably makes us unique as a species, humans, compared to other animals. So yeah, endocasts, the little bony impressions on the skull that reflect the brain or surround the brain rather, are another really tantalizing piece of evidence where it's like you almost can see kind of what the brain looked like, but not quite. And so it's this fun puzzle of what does this little piece of a rock tell us about the brains of these animals that lived, hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago even. So that's kind of my brainy beginnings.
Absolutely. And the brain and what you were talking about, quote, what makes us special if, we are. Um, that's what I want to focus on for my PhD is the development of the brain and endocast and all that, which was why I was bummed when I heard you guys don't offer a PhD at your college, because
Yeah,
the work you're doing, honestly, I was like, that
yeah.
sounds so interesting. But
Yeah, I would love if I could take on students, but yeah, Vassar's it's a small liberal arts
right,
undergraduate college, and we have great students, and I've had a lot of fun working with with uh, with students, but yeah, we just don't have the capacity for more in-depth stuff.
right.
Um,
So what do you think is next for you on like what you just said you have a new paper coming out. You're holding literally a piece of what's in your new paper.
oh,
So what's next?
yeah, so this is actually an earlier paper it's already out. I've got a couple things in the works right now that I feel badly for my collaborators because I'm just a little overextended and I'm having trouble keeping up with all of it. So I'm still doing work on Homo naledi. I started the Homo naledi work kind of in that vein of growth and development.
Mhm.
And so we have some really exciting, I think very exciting infant remains that we think represent a single individual, a single little infant, but it's they're some of the most scrappy and fragmentary pieces I've ever worked with. I actually have 3D prints of those upstairs in my office, but not down here. Yeah, I don't have anything down here,
Yeah, I see
unfortunately.
some Naledi up there, but not
Yeah.
fragments.
But so we're trying to get those descriptions and analyses out, and so I really need to acknowledge the work of my collaborators, especially Heather Garvin at Des Moines University, Davorka Radovcic at the Zagreb Croatian I can't talk, Croatian National History Museum, Gideon Chinnamatira, who's a graduate student at Wits, who took care of all the CT scanning
Mhm.
of these really tiny remains. John Hawks, of course. And there's a lot of other people
Right. Big
that I'm
team. Right,
most
right.
closely working most closely with to try to get this material analyzed. So that's one thing that is kind of on the horizon. Going along with that, we have the inner ear cavity of
Mhm.
some Homo naledi that will be very interesting because that will tell us about locomotion and hearing,
Right.
and we also evolutionary relationships. But that's yeah, that's that's down the line. But the other big project that I'm working on is kind of illustrated on my mug here, looking at gibbons because they're a very relatively overlooked type of ape because they're kind of most distantly related
Right.
uh, species compared to the great apes. And they're smaller, so I mean, there's reasons why people kind of haven't looked at them in the context of hominin evolution. Um, but my colleague Julia Zichello, who's at Hunter College in New York, um, had a nice little article a few years ago outlining reasons why gibbons would actually make a really interesting model for understanding the variability that we see in the human fossil
Mhm.
record in the past several millions of years. So I've got, half the time I'm, looking at CT scans of gibbons, and half the time I'm looking at little bits of Homo naledi, and so it's fun. We're having fun here in the lab. So we've got lots of projects going. Um,
So,
yeah.
for my reference, because I don't know, and I'm sure many of my viewers don't know, when did gibbons diverge from? the last common ancestor?
Yeah, so gibbons are a fun little group. They're often referred to as the lesser apes. And probably they diverged from the lineage that led to the great apes, somewhere around like 19 million years ago or
Wow.
so. I want to
Okay.
say 19. Um,
And then for reference, everyone chimps split about like 7 6 7 million years
yeah,
ago.
yeah. So
So
it's a very deep divergence, but and there's not a really a good fossil record for gibbons, but we know on the basis of genetic studies largely that the gibbons themselves, I mean, today there are about 20 or so different species
oh wow.
and
Okay.
four different genera, which is a weird way to say, the genus like Hylobates and Nomask, Homo paranthropus, so those kinds of things. There's four different major groups of gibbons that differ in the number of chromosomes that they have, but basically the big radiation or diversification that we see of gibbons happen around the same time scale and time frame as the radiation of hominins in the past 8 million years or so. So there's a kind of evolutionary and diversity perspective that they can shed on the, sorry, let me say that again. They can be an interesting model for understanding hominin variation because of the similar time frame in which they diversified. And so that's just one of the many angles that we're trying to look at there. Yeah, so they wouldn't be obvious as a group to
Hmm.
study, but because they've been overlooked for so long that actually the time is ripe, I think, to study them. Plus, many of the species are very highly endangered. And so I feel like, any bit of research that we can do on them, even if it's just skeletal remains,
Right.
is going to bring attention to these highly endangered primates. And so it gives me an excuse to bring that up when I'm talking about them in class and stuff like that.
Absolutely, which is
Yeah.
always a great thing to do. I always feel anthropologists, I have not met one that's not also a conservationalist. I
Yeah.
Anthropologists seem to just, besides anthropology, they also seem to be naturalists, and protecting the natural world just seems to come up. So I mean, it's great, and I fully obviously support it on the same way, but just it's such a thing that I think unites everyone in the community, even when so many things don't. I don't know. It's just something I've noticed.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm not sure how much of this, it's like a chicken and egg kind of scenario. Is it because we study endangered animals and extinct animals and different time frames, or not time frames, but like geological periods
Mhm.
that are very different from today, that just kind of puts this on our radar and makes us more aware of the existential crisis that many species and habitats and such are in right now? Or is it that general angle that we already kind of have in our heads, and then that's what makes us interested in the past, living
Right.
in, or to what extent is it both of them?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, what can we glean from your work that we couldn't if we were looking at the fossils from the typical perspective that we were mentioning earlier of this is a Homo erectus, this is a Homo habilis? What can we learn that we wouldn't learn otherwise?
Yeah, so I would say, I would hope that my research helps show kind of how a lot of the major evolutionary changes came about in terms of like how growth and development were actually modified. And so I have some work on Australopithecus or Paranthropus robustus, for instance, and their jaws, or the faces of Neanderthals is another project that I did with Frank Williams, where we're really uh, showing the kind of patterns of developmental change that might underlie the major anatomical differences that have been identified. And an important thing here is a lot of this relies on or very intentionally incorporates fragmentary fossils. There's a lot of emphasis on the really complete specimens because they're really
Right.
complete. You don't have to guess or estimate or this and that. And so a lot of my earlier work was really aimed at just kind of just like almost wringing out all the drips of information, drops of information that we can from a pretty sparse and fragmentary fossil record. So I would say that's probably the main thing. I do think that the series of papers that I've done on the brain growth might point to kind of the way in which brain size evolved. We have these really big brains, and so one thing that I think is kind of neat from this simulation-based approach that I had developed, I think that kind of shows that possibly with the earliest hominins, Australopithecus afarensis, you have perhaps prolonged but slow rates of brain growth, so that they get these brains that are kind of a little bit bigger than chimps and comparable to gorillas, but at a pretty small body size, so that you get the earliest stages of encephalization or increased brain size through just prolonging the growth period a little bit. And then with Homo erectus, we see higher rates of growth, and possibly a little bit kind of bigger brain sizes at birth as well. And then it's kind of, from Homo erectus then onward, just bigger newborn brain sizes and higher growth rates that have contributed to our really big energy draining, but culturally enabled brains that we have today.
Absolutely. And it's just such a fascinating, I mean, we're talking about an electrical meatball that causes everything we know. So I think studying the brain
Might
is
think of it an electrical ball.
yeah, I heard that somewhere the other day and I was just like, that's amazing.
Well, it's a lot more fat than meat, so I am
well, yeah,
like,
but
what would be a good food we could throw in? Meatballs is it sounds nice, but what's a nice packet of fat? Now food things are
yeah,
me,
I
but
know. Yeah,
yeah,
we're anthropologists, not chefs. I
it's
don't know.
pretty wild.
Yeah, exactly. So what, getting more technical. So evolution, generally speaking, is change over time. Watching features that adapt to environments to help the specimen better survive over time, etc. What causes changes in growth and development? Is it genetic that happens? Is it environmental? Is it a mix? What causes these changes?
Yeah, that is a good question. We actually, in my race and variation class, just kind of went over this with high altitude adaptation as an
Right.
example. It's like, are these things that are genetically kind of largely influenced by genes that had increase in frequency over time in these populations that have lived at high altitude for generations, or do we have when you live at high altitude and there's not as much oxygen, your body is adapting as you are growing to your lung capacity or something like that. And it's not always easy to tease apart these differences.
Right,
And that's
right.
things I think is very fun about growth and development is our bones are actually living tissue and structures. And so they will have at least the capacity to adapt to the forces that they endure and experience during life. And so, I mean, there's I guess lots of different points along the general kind of process of being a little embryo and having your general tissues actually being formed and structured and organized and all that, to when you're actually a little blob that has little bits of bone and cartilage more or less in place that are trying to expand in the proper directions while keeping you as a coherent, viable organism. It's like self-building robots or something like that. It's pretty incredible. Yeah, so actually another paper that I'm working on right now is looking at how we might see the evolution of finger proportions by way of these embryonic stages of what's called pattern formation. So, I mean, you can have things that are presumably, genetically determined or genetically influenced that will kind of lay down the anatomies that will eventually appear, fully formed later on during adulthood. But a lot of it will depend, I guess, on what what structures you're looking at,
Mm,
and kind of what age groups and all of that, because um, something like height and stature and body size, these are things that um, on average will be very important for, species life history adaptations, and how many calories they require, and how and stuff like that. But size, like stature and body mass, are also going to be very plastic and
hmm
environmentally influenced, because if you're malnourished for whatever reason, or if you get really, really sick during the growth period, that might slow down your growth, uh, so that you would ultimately, not be the size that you would if you didn't have those stressors there. And so that's a really tricky place of, what's the role or relationship between your genes and the environment, um, and kind of forming what you end up, the type of animal or that you end up becoming. Um, I don't know, that kind of makes sense.
Yes, it
Or
did. It did.
there's so many different ways that this could happen. Because I mean, teeth are like this whole other thing, right? Because teeth are pretty robust to environmental insults for the most part. And people have been able to track through looking at microscopy and really clever analyses. I'm thinking of the work by Tanya Smith, for
hmm
instance, and Timothy Bromage earlier on, looking at it. You can actually track the movement of individual enamel forming cells,
mm
uh, kind of like, is that the Litoli footprints that you have as your
Yes,
back?
it is.
You kind of have these ameloblast, which is the type of cells that produce enamel. Well, it becomes enamel. Um, it's a ameloblast footprint trail, through the crown of a tooth. That will, you will get disruption due to nutritional stress or something like that. That's something that you can actually document in teeth. Um, but yeah, I mean, like the ultimate size and shape of a tooth is probably going to be much more genetically influenced than the size and shape of a person, like a whole body,
Right,
right?
right.
So it's um, again, it all becomes a fun puzzle of trying to figure out causation and um, directionality and stuff like that. That probably didn't
Absolutely.
make any sense. I'm starting to.
No,
It's
it did. It totally did. It
it's
totally
a
did.
fun puzzle.
The basic information that I got from that I think people should understand is it depends on what feature we're talking about. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
the
Actually,
the
that's a
teeth,
great.
yeah, the teeth will develop because of these reasons. The eyes will develop because of these reasons. They might be the same. They might be different.
Yeah.
Um,
The skull is another great example of this,
yeah.
right? Because the shape of the skull is going to be driven by size of the brain, but also, I mean, you have your teeth that have to be a certain size and fit in your jaw. You have your nasal and your oral cavities that have to be a certain size for you to, breathe in enough oxygen, or chew enough food or something like that. And so these structures themselves will kind of drive what your overall skull looks like. But we
hmm
have lots of archaeological and even modern day evidence of, you can modify the shape of a skull
Right.
by pressure during growth. And so you'll see babies with helmets now, right? Because
hmm
they on their head, and that left a little flat spot. So they're trying to mold it some kind of, I don't know how they decide what shape to put it in the end.
Right. Right.
But it's again this fun interplay of what is causing the bones to look the way they do.
Right. Right. Um,
Tissues, it's forces that they're experiencing during life. Is it the underlying brain that's growing, etc.?
and I think it's safe to say that often it's both. A lot
Yeah.
of especially during development, the environment inside the womb and outside the womb can affect a lot of what's going on. And I think people didn't realize that. They thought kind of being in the womb was the safe
Mhm.
sphere that you didn't have to worry about what was going on. But thankfully, I think we're realizing, what the mother consumes, etc., that happens to the baby, and that can affect how they grow.
Mhm.
Um, so, what do you think is the most important aspect of your research? Like, what is your goal in what you're doing? obviously it's a passion, you love it, but is there a goal that you're like, this is obviously you had your dissertation and you had a question that you answered. Do you have
Yeah.
another question right now that's just burning a hole in your dreams at night?
Honestly, not really. Because I've been very lucky over the course of my career that things have largely kind of worked out.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean, I find that I'm very easily distracted and distractible, and I just kind of want to learn new things. And so I find my research taking these directions that really I never would have thought of, years before, let alone, not even less time. Um, I've been fortunate to be in a position where if I see something that I think is very interesting, I can try to pursue that kind of on my own. A lot of the research that I do is fairly small scale, and so I don't need to apply for really big grants or anything like that. And um, I mean, I have some plans of what I would do if I had a big grant, but I'm also not like, this is what I have to do or else my life is over, my
Right.
career is over. And one thing that I think, I don't know, especially in our field, and maybe just academia as a whole, I think there's a big risk of people taking themselves too seriously.
Mhm.
Uh, and this is my life's work, and I have to get this done. They disagreed with me, and it's like none of this really matters that much, especially when you have a kind of long term, deep time geological perspective of, I mean, the world as we know it today has changed quite drastically just in the past. I mean, since the pandemic, for instance, since nine
Mhm.
11, since the Industrial Revolution, like there's really nothing that I feel so passionately about that would um, kind of make me stop everything that I'm doing in pursuit of the one thing, which I guess is kind of sad in a way. But no, I have this general curiosity of life in the past and how
Mhm.
things work, and if I can tackle it at a kind of low level, and not low level, but without many resources, and especially if I can get students involved,
Right.
uh, that's one thing I would love to do. So I've got this CT data set that I've built up um, in the past 2 years because, like I said, my research doesn't require too much funding, but I had an endowed chair while I was an assistant professor that got me just small pockets of money that I used to CT scan this big growth
Mhm.
series of human skulls. And so I've got students now that are working on, the bony labyrinth or the inner ear of these gibbons because no one's really looked at this before. And I've got some students that are looking at how the face is growing because
Mhm.
people have looked at it, but not in a single basically population or even species of gibbons. Um, yeah, so I don't know. I'm a big nerd. So I want to do some projects. I want to make some graphs. I want to go home and go for a run and play the guitar and just kind of teach my classes, lay low and not make too much of a splash if I'm honest.
That sounds pretty good to me, honestly.
So I'll, I'll,
So
I'll try to do.
so,
Don't
with that very relaxing sounding life, what
not relax.
not
I'll
relaxing,
tell you
okay.
then. But I would like
Um,
to be able to relax.
yes. What do you try to tell your students or prospective students or people, who want to get involved in this field? What do you tell them or what can you tell them when they try to face these challenges of getting to a position such as yours? How do they get there? What do they do? And why should they not give up?
That's a very big question. Um, I if I can be completely honest, I've been very lucky along the way. I mean, obviously I've worked very hard, but sometimes you're just in the right place at the right time. Um, and so I think one thing that needs to be appreciated and acknowledged is that just there's so much chance involved in
Mhm.
in in academia. Um, which is not always the most reassuring thing. We have this, it's hard. This is Seth, I'm sorry, this is a very tricky question because we're at this point in time in an economy where there are not very many jobs,
Right.
which is its whole other, there's all kinds of political and historical and economic things that kind of have gone into that. So I would say, follow what you find interesting as long as it doesn't, crush you along the way. Which sounds, I think maybe some of that is just kind of the mental state that I'm in at this moment. But one thing that I think is cool that you're doing right now actually is this science communication and actually, developing the skills to, I saw you have like new equipment to, make the recording
Yeah.
and all that. Like, I mean, you're getting these very practical and applied skills kind of along the way of learning the science as well. And so I think one thing that no one really talked about when I was in graduate school a million years ago, that much, at least not in our program, was, have ideas of things that you would do that aren't being a professor, because on the one hand, there's just not that many opportunities, unfortunately, anymore. And on the other hand, it is a lot of work, and it is fun, but there's other things that you can do with this training, right? So this is probably not the the inspirational speech you were looking for, but I would say, follow what you're interested in, but don't lose sight of yourself. You have to take care of yourself along the way. But I guess the flip side of that is you also can't take a lot of things too personally, because when they don't work out, which happens a lot in academia, whether it's applying for jobs, whether it's trying to publish papers and applying for grants, I mean, you will face a lot of rejection, not because of anything about you yourself personally, usually, but just because
Usually,
there's
yeah.
finite, usually, but there's finite resources, and often it might come down to the specific quirks or interests of someone who's reviewing whatever the things are at the time that have nothing to do with you. So I would say, I guess my other piece of advice would be to, definitely pursue what you find interesting, but don't make it your identity, or don't make it all of your identity, because like I said, I don't remember what I said, but running the
No,
risk of taking it seriously, it's just, at the end of the day, we're uncovering kind of what makes us special, and what I think is why it's important that we're more cooperative than competitive at the local and at the broader global scale.
right.
But we're also, I mean, we're just trying to educate people,
Absolutely.
whether it's our students, whether it's people in another town somewhere that are seeing a talk or watching a video or something like that. Um, I think Mark Kissel and Augustin Fuentes and probably many others have pointed out that there's so much pop culture, sensational books and movies and self-help things about like humans are adapted to do this, and this is what's normal and natural, and really anthropologists and in many ways biological anthropologists and paleoanthropologists really have a unique perspective and expertise in saying, well, this is what humans are actually
Right.
all about. This is what actually makes us unique, and this is what is human nature, and this is why whatever this person is saying is not really human nature. It's a very specific cultural manifestation or something like that.
Absolutely.
So I mean, I think as a field we have a lot to offer and contribute, but we can do this in lots of ways that aren't necessarily being professors in schools. So yeah, but you do have to go out, put yourself out there and apply and do your best. But yeah, you never know what opportunities will arise. So be open to stuff too. I guess that would be another piece of advice. Take
And
opportunity.
I I think you bring up a point that a lot of my other guests have not, and it's the frank point that you bring up that yeah, professorships are rare, And I think I've said on the show many times, don't go into this field if you're looking to make money. It's not the field for that. It's definitely more of you have a goal in mind. But oh, what was I gonna say? um, oh, so you bring up the point that yes, there are plenty of other ways that you can be involved in anthropology and biological anthropology that aren't just a professorship. You know,
Mhm.
there's museums, there's working in schools, there's so many different ways that you can use the knowledge that you gain, and you shouldn't be discouraged just because, I mean, I being on social media so often and having the community that I'm a part of, you know, your colleagues and everything, so many people that are in the field already. I see the job postings and they're not that common. They're pretty rare. There's a PhD position here, you know, postdoc there. And like you said, it's all about opportunities and advantages. And when you see one, you have to take it in this field or you will miss it. So if I can offer advice, I think that would be it. If that opportunity lands on your doorstep, you take it.
My first job out of grad school was in Kazakhstan at this brand new university that they were building. And I remember um, one of my advisors saying, are you sure you want to do this? You know, you might, you know, we don't know anything about this place and you might end up stuck out there. And my other advisor was like, why not? And you know, I again like that I had not gotten other jobs that had come up at the time. And so I was like, well, it's an opportunity. And, you know,
Mhm.
I was young enough at the time too that there wasn't much that I wasn't beholden to anybody or anything. So I could afford to pick up and move to, you know, the other side of the world. Um, yeah, you don't know what's going to come up. So you can't lose hope and you got to be open to new ideas and experiences. But I think people that kind of are attracted to this field or are generally kind of open to
Mhm.
new experiences. And I think there's kind of some personality traits maybe that might make you more likely to take those kinds of chances, I guess.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, I'm gonna leave these last few minutes if there's anything you want to say specifically before we wrap it up. If you want, you know, I know you just gave some words of wisdom, so if there's just anything you want to
Some
close
very
with.
dispiriting words of wisdom. Uh, yeah. Honestly, I don't really have a lot to say. Again, we're in the middle of like grading frenzy and
Yeah,
all kinds of stuff
exactly.
right now, and so my brain is just kind of like, what's happening? Um, yeah, I really have absolutely nothing at all. Find hobbies, I guess.
Find hobbies, you know, that's
Piece of
good
advice.
advice too.
Yeah, I didn't when I was in in graduate school and I was younger. I don't know why I keep referring to this because I got my PhD 11 years ago now at this point. It was a life ago. But no, I think I was so like focused on like, oh, I have to, you know, read and do research and do all this stuff. And like it didn't take enough time to do other things and kind
Mhm.
of let my mind wander to other stuff. And so I would definitely advise or recommend to the next generation to, you know, on top of everything, make sure that you're, you know, doing other stuff outside of work because there will always be work and um, it's not going to go anywhere if you take some time for yourself. Yeah, I don't know. Do you have any other questions or anything or
I mean, you know, I think we had a pretty thorough conversation on your work and, you know, why you do it and your future aspirations in your field.
yeah.
I mean, the last thing I guess I would ask, and you've kind of done this already, is there anyone else you would like to thank or give a shout out to who has helped you get to where you are or is working with you now?
Yeah, it's like an Oscar speech or something like that. Yeah, my department chair, April Besaw, is a historical archaeologist, and she has been fantastic, super supportive. super organized, super, she set a very great example of kind of what it means to really genuinely care about um others in your field, how to lift people up,
Mhm.
that I can try to emulate, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to do as good of a job. um Jeremy De Silva and Adam Van Arsdale and John Hawks have always been very supportive of me over the past several years, um, on the job market and stuff like that. And so I wouldn't be where I am without them, for sure. And they're great people to hang out with and to work with, and all of that. Um, I don't know. I could make a very big list, but I guess those are the kind of people that most immediately come to mind in terms of getting to where I've gotten to today. I'm sure I've missed lots of people. Um, yeah. But what about you? How did you get into paleoanthropology?
Well,
All the different kinds of anthropology.
what?
Of all the different kinds of
Oh,
anthropology.
so I hadn't even heard of anthropology until I took a bioanth 101 class as a um, requirement to get my AA degree. And I wanted to be a sign language interpreter, actually. So I was a deaf studies major.
Oh wow.
Um, and I took that class, and that was it. There was no going back. There
Yeah,
was
it's like, oh
no,
gosh.
yeah, there was no looking at anything else. I was just like, this is it. This is what I want to spend my life doing. And right at that time, it was 2013. So
Hmm.
right in the news and everything was Homo naledi, and it was actually pop culture, and it was just everywhere. So I was like, wow, what is this? What's going on? And it just really pulled me in. And then so the last 10 years has just been paleoanthropology. I mean, it's been a singular focus. I
Yeah.
mean, I do plenty of other things. I have tons of hobbies, like you mentioned, but it has been just, I mean, I started World of Paleoanthropology. I think my YouTube channel's birthday or anniversary, whatever you want to call it, was actually like 3 days ago.
Oh wow. Happy
Um, yeah,
birthday.
thank you. And I think it's 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old. So I just had this passion that everything I want to learn everything about humans, and then I want to share everything that I
Oh,
learn.
that's
And
really
I can't help it. Like it's just such a passion. Like even at my work, I'm an after school academy instructor where we do supplemental education for kids after school. So it's not homework, it's not tutoring. We actually teach them things.
mhm.
And so I'm doing this whole thing on paleoanthropology. I'm bringing skulls in. Brianna Pobiner sent me these lesson plans I've adapted to like elementary school kids. It's going to
Oh
be
nice.
this fun little activity that we're going to do. And yeah, it's what I do. It's what I do.
Oh, that's great. That's so important because I think people think that paleontology is for for kids or something like that, right? But I
Hmm.
think what you're showing is that it's not just dinosaurs and like weird monsters. Like this
Right.
was us, right? Like your show is called the story of us. Like
Exactly.
we have this really remarkable history that is only written in these pieces of bone that have managed
Hmm.
to survive, that we've been lucky enough to find over the past several hundred years at this point.
Exactly.
Um, that's cool. That's great. It's nice that you're doing that work.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yes, it's very fulfilling.
Good, good. I had another thing. Now I don't remember what it was going to be. Uh, oh, yeah. When you'd mentioned sign language, um, have you looked into the like ape gestural communication?
I just had Dr. Christy Graham on the show.
Uh,
She was actually the last episode, um, I think. Yeah.
mm,
And so we were talking about gestural communication among chimps and great apes. And it was very interesting. And I find, again, going back to the roots of what makes us human and brain development, language is an extremely important part of that. We wouldn't have our theory of mind without a way to think about it.
mm,
Um, so, you know, the thing that I love doing is telling everyone that what they're doing is anthropology. Because, if it involves humans, it's anthropology. So deaf studies, that was studying a language, that was linguistics, that was anthropology. Didn't realize it at the time, but I was still,
Yeah.
doing anthropology.
Should have you
Um,
talk to the cultural anthropologist from my department. Don't tell him I said that. Or do. I don't care at this point.
but yeah, it's fun. It's a fun life.
It is. It is. Unless you're doing something in R and this program, the code won't work or something like that. You're just like,
Yeah,
what?
yeah,
Not working. And then it
but
worked.
yeah. So I think, that is a great place for us to end this episode. I've had an absolutely fantastic time talking with you. It was a blast. And I really do appreciate you coming on the show and accepting my invitation. I'm definitely less nervous about sending these invites out now than I was 4 years ago, but
Yeah.
it's still, I am asking people who are very busy to come onto my show, and I very much appreciate you taking the time.
No worries. I'm happy to have been able to chat here, and I'm glad that you invited me. And if it makes you feel any better, it still takes me like 30 minutes, 40, sometimes an hour to like craft an email to people, even if they're people that I'm already working with. So you're not alone there. Don't worry about that.
Absolutely. Well, again, I want to thank you for coming on, and everyone, I hope you enjoyed and learned something new because, as I like to say, there is always more to learn. And with that, we will say goodbye.